But the history of physiotherapy in New Zealand over the last 4 decades has moved really from physiotherapy, which was totally subservient to medicine, to now a profession of professional autonomy. In the 60s, physiotherapy was prescribed by doctors, very specifically prescribed by doctors as to what you had to do. Doctors dominated the continuing education of physiotherapists. There were very few physiotherapy authors, and there were very few people who were prepared to speak out about their clinical experience and what their clinical experience was actually teaching them. Training was very much craft-oriented, and university education for physiotherapists was only a dream. In 1965, I joined the New Zealand Society of Physiotherapists Auckland branch and was a member of that branch until 73. And actually, 68 through 71, I think it was, I was president, and we ran a conference, one of the national conferences at that time. And whilst I was on the committee, there were several, of course, there was always continuing education and those things, but there were two really quite significant things that impacted later on the history of physiotherapy. First, in 1966, Alan Aldred, who was the professor of orthopaedics at Otago Medical School, wrote a report extolling the virtues of university education for physiotherapists. Well, he was a voice in the wilderness, but what that did was to spark the interest amongst the profession that yes, it could be done. And what do you know? 25 years later, in 1991, both Auckland and Otago schools became degree-granting institutions, and of course that taught me that you just never give up on these ambitions. And the other thing that we dealt with in the branch way back in those days was the 1967 report by Justice Owen Woodhouse on the treatment of injury by accident of people, and what was it called now? Compensation for Personal Injury in New Zealand by Justice Owen Woodhouse. And that, of course, was the forerunner of the formation of the Accident Compensation Commission, as it was then called. But meantime, I started a private practice in Papakura, which was a country town in those days. But from 65 onwards, Stan Paris started to run the first courses in manipulative physiotherapy, and Stan and Ian Sim from Christchurch were the two people who really set courses underway for physiotherapists in the mid-60s. And that culminated in 1968 in the formation of the New Zealand Physiotherapists Association. And I remember driving down to Taupo with Len Ring in his old Austin car, which had been modified because Len had had one of the first total hip replacements earlier in that year. The Chandley hip replacement surgery was first done, I think, by Ross Nicholson and John Morris around about 1965 at Middlemore in New Zealand, and Len got one of those first hips. Anyway, he had to modify his car a little bit so he could get in and out with ease, and we drove to Taupo in this rattly old bomb. And I think there were about 18 or 20 of us who met at the Lakeside Hotel in Taupo for the formation of the New Zealand Manipulative Therapists Association. Rob McKenzie, I believe, was the first president. And this was against huge mainstream opposition. In fact, there were people saying that they wouldn't be referring to physiotherapists. Doctors would not be referring to physiotherapists who were signing up to the New Zealand Manipulative Therapist Association. Well, from that meeting, a number of New Zealand physiotherapists went to the Canary Islands to take part in what was to become the forerunner of the International Federation of Orthopaedic Manipulative Therapy, when Freddie Carlton-Bourne arranged a meeting in the Canary Islands where people came together and actually had hands-on classes, but also sat down and began to formulate some standards around manipulative therapy and what would be required of physiotherapists in the future were they to have competency in manipulative physiotherapy. And these therapists came back, Rob McKenzie and Ian Searle amongst them, and set up the NZMTA, which began to set those standards. I was fortunate enough to get my diploma of NZMTA in 74. I think I was reached about number 14 on the certificate, so those were early days. The other thing that was gathering at that time was the New Zealand Private Physiotherapists Association. Through the 60s, there became a call more and more for private physiotherapists to come together on a national basis. There had been a New Zealand Private Physiotherapists Association set up in Wellington in about 1958, and again Rob McKenzie was part of that, Craig Cameron, Keith Ritson, some wonderful people in Wellington, but it took on a national hue through the 60s, and I became president of the National New Zealand Physiotherapists Association in 1972 through to 79. And Mike Lamont was the secretary, and again Mike Lamont is just one of those unsung heroes in New Zealand physiotherapy who has contributed immensely to the development of modern physiotherapy and its autonomy in New Zealand. The beginnings of accident compensation, of course, led to physiotherapists making a strong call to be included in the Commission's funding. And I well remember John Maul, Mike Lamont and myself making submissions to Ken Fahey, the then chairman of the Commission, and several of his commissioners, pleading for the inclusion of physiotherapy into the Accident Compensation Commission scheme. And the Commission, we spent 2 hours on a Thursday afternoon in late December, and I'm pretty sure it was 1973, when the Commission were telling us about the risks of including physiotherapy, and we were telling them about the benefits of including physiotherapy into the Commission's ethos, because our plea was that this was not just about compensation for injury, but it was about rehabilitation from injury. And at the end of our tense 2-hour session, Ken Fahey got up and strode around the room, giving us a lecture on what the government's ambitions for the Commission were, and he finished by saying, and the Commissioners have decided to include physiotherapy within the Commission's payment scheme. He then walked over to his drinks cabinet and poured us all very strong drinks, which was great. So I'm not sure whether we did physiotherapy a favour or not by seeking that formal inclusion, and I have to say that John Maul and Mike Lamont worked very hard on that whole thing. In 1973, the Auckland School opened, and of course the Society was very concerned about that. And I think I'm right in thinking that Fran Alkin was the first head of the school. She was charge physiotherapist at Middlemore and worked at Middlemore whilst I was there. But of course the Auckland School provided a very different sort of training from the Otago School. It doubled the number of practitioners in the field, and that was of a concern of the Society, and we all thought, well, I'm not sure where my career is going to be if we're going to have twice as many physiotherapists around, but it was all quite all right because it was a whole new view about physiotherapy, and it was invigorating rather than debilitating. As president of the Private Practitioners Association, the 1979 Commission of Inquiry into the state funding of chiropractic services was of great concern to us, and it was my role to marshal resources in order that we might take a case to the Commission. I wrote many of the submissions myself. There are 2 volumes of my writings somewhere around in some library. I think the Hocken Library might have a couple of volumes of my writings on physiotherapy in 1970s language, I tend to suspect. But the whole profession rallied around that cause. I'm pretty sure that Gay Wood was the president of the New Zealand Society at that time, and she held the troops together while we made representations to the Commission of Inquiry into chiropractic. Now, whilst physiotherapy actually lost the case, that is to say that chiropractors did actually win state funding, we won in the sense that physiotherapy established itself yet again as distinct from medicine, as having its own view about musculoskeletal medicine, that we again reaffirmed our growing professional autonomy. And the one thing that the Commission of Inquiry did was to make physiotherapy, in a sense, grow up and become much more mature, and much more self-directed, and as such I see it as a great success. In the late 70s and the early 80s, physiotherapists continually assumed more and more responsibility for the primacy of direct contact with patients. And that self-belief really grew from the Commission of Inquiry into Chiropractic. And that autonomy, that professional autonomy, was formally consolidated in the 1999 Accident Insurance Act, which was an iteration of the Accident Compensation Commission Act. It was a second iteration, there's been a third since. But the 99 iteration of the Accident Insurance Act confirmed physiotherapists as being primary contact practitioners. Again, a huge leap forward for the profession. Just going back in the 1980s, and again this was very much a part of our maturing, New Zealand ran the International Federation of Orthopaedic Manipulative Therapists Conference in Christchurch. That was a huge event, really orchestrated by another wonderful physiotherapist called Jean Buswell, now retired. She whipped us all into line, and we brought wonderful people from overseas again, heads of all the various schools of manipulative therapy. James Syriacs, of course, Alan Stoddard from the osteopathic school, Vladimir Yanda from musculoskeletal medicine, Stan Paris, and Richard Earhart from the chiropractic schools in the United States. And we in New Zealand managed to bring those people together for this wonderful conference of the IFOMT. And again, a great tribute to the eclecticism, I think, of New Zealand physiotherapists, their willingness to reach out for all kinds of enriching education. In 1981, I was lucky enough to be awarded the OBE, and in 1990, the Queen's Jubilee Medal. But in 1990, between 1990 and 1993, Mike Lamont, Margot Skinner and myself were very much involved in a steering committee for the New Zealand College of Physiotherapy, or what is now the New Zealand College of Physiotherapy. And this was all about raising the educational standards of physiotherapists. In 1997, I was made a life member of the New Zealand Manipulative Therapists Association, which I found a great tribute, really, because 20 years before we had founded the association, and I was just very pleased to be part of that.